Thank you for joining us on the Going Deeper podcast, a ministry of Fathom Church in Littleton, Colorado. You will never get to the bottom of the depths that are in Christ for you. And our hope with this podcast is that it will help you go deeper with God. So let's dive into this episode of the Going Deeper podcast. What's up, everyone? This is your host, Kyle Knight, and welcome to the Going Deeper podcast, a podcast where we just have conversations to help you go deeper in your relationship with God. I'm in the podcast studio here at Fathom Church with Karina Boss. Hello, Karina.
Hello.
And Chris Martin, Pastor
Buenos
Chris Martin.
dias.
Buenos dias again.
Yeah.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Good whenever.
Good whenever.
This is.
Good whenever it is.
Good whenever this is.
Hey, this is so I said in my sermon on Sunday that that Marcy and I disagree on how to squeeze toothpaste out of the toothpaste tube. And it's made me think about some things. I thought we should have a deeply psychologically revealing question to kind of get us started today. And so here's the question. Do you floss? And if so, how often?
I do floss.
Honest to goodness, real deal. Do you floss, and how often?
I floss every night.
You're a religious flosser. Pharisaical, some might say.
Wow.
Well, I once heard, thank you, Bridget, that it actually is better to floss than to brush. So
That's right. She told us
She
that.
said, if you're going to pick one, floss.
Wait,
and
what?
Yep.
What?
Yep.
This is a dental hygienist friend of ours, member of the church, who said that it is better to floss than it is to brush.
I've got to rethink everything now.
Do you, so Karina's a religious flosser. Do you use regular floss, or do you use the flossers, or like a pick, like a
No,
water
I
pick?
use real floss, and because I hear like the bacteria can transfer between like teeth. So you should like clean floss between every.
Oh, wow.
So yeah,
Do you
my
do
floss
that?
is like
You
a
use,
full
like,
body length.
You use
worth
6 feet of floss
Yes,
every day?
Yep,
Yeah.
I do.
Wow. That's
I mean,
impressive.
Yep.
That,
Luckily, floss is
my
cheap.
respect for you already was at a high, but it's like tripled in the last 2 seconds. So Kyle, real honest
So your
moment
first
here.
question was, do you floss?
Yes.
Sure, I do floss. How often? Not that often.
Okay.
I mean, it's like once a week,
Okay.
but
No,
now I
that's
feel
fair.
like I need to be doing it.
Well, I mean, according to
Every-
the Pharisee in the group, yes, you should.
Can I ask one more question? Do you, Karina, floss before you brush or after you brush, or does it matter?
I floss after.
Because it's more important. than
I don't
brushing
know
is.
if there's
The rhythm matters, I think.
I do after. I
okay.
brush and then floss. But
You brush and floss. What
I do floss, yes.
you do floss?
I would say I probably floss 5 out of 7 days. Sometimes I'm tired and I just get lazy.
Yeah.
But I'm probably a solid 5 days a week flosser. And I do the rhythm of brush first, floss second, and then I use mouthwash, like a rinse for my receding gum lines third. That's what I do.
Wow. And nobody uses the power floss thing.
The water
The
pick,
water.
Or-
I heard that messes up your teeth.
I've never used it.
I've never
We gotta
used
ask
one.
Bridget.
I use old
Is
school
that-
floss. I don't like flossers.
Yeah,
I use
no.
old school floss,
Those things
but I don't
hurt.
do 6 feet, and I don't like move it every single tooth. That's a
Oh.
lot of floss.
I use a bunch. I
I use
gotta,
floss,
wrap it
like
around all my fingers.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is like I use it to cut
Move it.
circulation off to the fingertips more than I do to actually like deal with bacteria. Okay, that was my that
I
I
mean, that's a good.
I just wanted to know like that. Do you floss? Okay, morning or night? Does it matter?
Evening. I do evening.
Yeah,
I have more time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm an evening flosser too.
When I floss, evening. Man, I just feel like my teeth are gross now.
Yeah, you
I
gross
gotta go
me
home
out,
and
man.
floss like every day.
You gross
Well,
me out.
you
Speaking
learn
of things that are gross,
you learn something. Learn something every new on this podcast about flossing. Yeah. So this episode we're going to be as we kind of bring a topic of conversation so we can go deeper into it. We're going to be talking about media and specifically media consumption. Now, if you've kind of checked out our podcast before, our previous 8 or so episodes, you've probably seen or maybe heard of our second episode was on social media. So we've kind of talked about social media specifically before. So if you haven't heard that, go back. I would encourage you to go back and listen to that. But now we're going to talk more specifically about media consumption, things like how much time we spend consuming things on our phone, TV, news, music, all that kind of stuff. Questions like, should we be more aware of the time we spend on these things? Is it really important to be thinking of how much things we are consuming? Should we have boundaries? All that kind of stuff. Does it become a point where there's too much consumption of media, and especially for Christians? Like, why is this really important? So let's start there. Like, why do you and this is for either of you, why do you guys feel like it's important to talk about this specifically when it comes to what we're taking in all the time?
I'm going to be honest. Since we did the cussing podcast, a verse has really kind of settled over me, and it's Ephesians 5:3-4, then jumping down to 6-9. But let there be no sexual immorality, impurity, or greed among you. Such sins have no place among God's people. Obscene stories, foolish talks, and coarse jokes, these are not for you. Instead, let there be thankfulness to God. Don't be fooled by those who try to excuse these sins, for the anger of God will fall on all who disobey him. Don't participate in the things these people do, for once you were full of darkness, but now you have the light from the Lord. So live as people of light. And that has just
boom.
Yeah,
like
but
mic
especially
drop.
the obscene stories, foolish talk, and coarse jokes. And I just was beginning to realize, like, most of the media consumption in our society is based around those things. And so really processing, what does that mean? Like, that verse and how that relates to what we like in media, what that is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's two pieces to this conversation really to have. And one is content, right? So like, what sort of content are you consuming? So then you begin to talk about, is it wholesome? Is it God glorifying? Or is it, degrading? Does it actually, affect us negatively? So I think there's that piece, the content piece, but then I think there's the quantity question as well. And I don't have any of these numbers in front of me, so again, I'm not going to be helpful here, but the amount of time that people spend, like American averages, is hours and hours. Kyle is pulling up his phone, so he must have some hours here.
You can keep going. I've got some.
I mean, it's
things.
just a lot of time. And I've heard some guys who legitimately are like, I'm not doing TV at all because, it's just a waste of my time. And I'm like, I've got one pastor friend who has legitimately said every night, instead of like when his kids went down to bed, he committed, instead of the 2 hours that he would watch TV, to prayer. And so for years, if not decades, he prays 2 hours a night. Now hear me. I love that. That sounds as awesome as anything. And also it sounds unbelievably unattainable to me, for even me. Like, I don't know how I could do that, but he's like, if I give myself over to 2 hours of prayer a night for my life, like, what would God do? Like, what kind of serious response would I get through the Holy Spirit? What kind of intimacy with Christ would I have? And I'm like, I've got no way to battle that idea. So if nothing else, I would say the conversation about quantity needs to be had at an individual level, but then as Christians, what's wise? Like, how much should we be, even if it's good stuff, or even if it's maybe morally neutral stuff, how much of it is actually us being good stewards of our time, of the time that God has given us? So I don't know.
Well, speaking of time,
yeah,
I wanted to pull up some statistics because I knew they would be insane. And this is from 2021, so a year ago. This is the U.S. That these are, like, on average, people spend about 463 minutes, or over 7.5 hours a day, consuming some type of media.
7 hours?
7.5 hours a day, Americans.
My heavens.
Okay, which is so, and then they go on a lot of other numbers, like there's an average of 12 media subscriptions. So that's like streaming services, like all of it combined. But that is insane to just think. And of course, like, any one of us could sit here and go, 7.5 hours, like, I don't do that. But it's like, how much time is that spent on? Yeah, maybe not like, you're watching videos for 7.5 hours, or you're on Instagram for 7.5 hours, or maybe it's not just social media, but it's just media in general, just things that can influence you, get into your mind, into your heart, and all this stuff. Like 7.5 hours. I mean, that's insane. But
yeah, well, if you think about it, it's like get up, turn on the news, get in my car, turn on the radio or turn on music, get to my office and, check the, scores from the games from the previous night. I, look at my ESPN app, I look at my Facebook app, I look at my Instagram app, check out Twitter, maybe see if there's any new YouTube subscriptions that I, like whatever those things are, let alone I'm going to watch, 2 or 3 shows after my kids go to bed, or like you can quickly see where those hours start to stack up. It's shocking when you say 7 hours. That sounds shocking to me. And yet at the same time, I'm like, yeah, I believe it.
Yeah. So let's start with the time, the amount of time we consume these things. Is there such a thing as too much media consumption? What do you guys think? Like, well, I mean, is there probably yes, but like, what is that? What is the line? Now, we can't really open to scripture and see where it said, like, it doesn't say, thou shalt not consume this much media. However, there's a lot of other stuff in there that we can point to. But what is like, is there a thing as too much? And what is that? What is that boundary? What is that thing that Christians should be like aware of, really? If like, are we spending too much time being inundated with all this stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think on a real practical level, before you start like counting hours and stuff, if you can just evaluate your life. Like we already did the podcast on like our quiet time. And if you're not having a quiet time and your excuses, I don't have time to do quiet time. I don't have time to pray. It's like, well, how many hours, really start thinking of how many hours a day are you spending watching movies or watching shows or listening to podcasts of any kind.
Yeah.
And then evaluate kind of just through that lens as a starter point to realize like, am I watching too much?
Right. Like, I mean, we always say that you give time to the things that you actually value. Right. And so what at least that study is, and what probably the anecdotal evidence that we've experienced and we see in our friends and family and all that around us, is that we value media consumption. We value being entertained, whether, and I think it's really important to mention podcasts and audiobooks and things like that too, because that's still all consumption, whether it's good, bad, or neutral. All of that stuff is input. It is noise that we are filling our heads with. And one of the downsides is, yes, our quiet times, yes, our time in the scripture, yes, our time in the word, in prayer, can be affected, but also our ability to practice some of the traditional disciplines like solitude, like silence, like actively listening for God, and even just quiet. Like when we say quiet time, like real quiet, like real removal of any sort of outside input we're being robbed of that. So I don't know how much is too much. Probably all of us are probably engaged in more than we ought to be. I would bet that 9 out of 10 or 99 out of 100 of us would probably, if we're honest, would say, yeah, I should probably not watch as much. I should probably not listen to as much. I should probably not scroll as much as I do.
What are, and maybe this is more of a practical thing, and we could get into like some of the actual content that we consume, but like, so if we have that thought of like, oh, it's probably too much, like what do we kind of do about that? Like, what are, as Christians, how do we know? Like, how do we know that it's too much? Like, what, when we are being affected, when we see it kind of seep into all of our, like the rest of our lives, like what kind of things should we maybe be looking for? It's not just, we've got that awesome screen time thing on your phone now that shows you how much time you stare at your phone, which is terrible, but also really convicting. But like, what are some of the things that might be a little bit of like, hey, an eye opener? Like, we should maybe like watch out. Maybe we're spending way too much time doing these sorts of things. What kind of things should we be looking for?
So I say all the time in sermons and other venues that there are things that stir up your affections for Christ, and there are things that rob you of your affections for Christ. And for me, when I watch too much, let's just say TV, whether it's a screen or actual TV, let's just call it video content, sports, movies, shows, video, YouTube clips, whatever it is. When I'm overindulging in that, I find my affections for Christ not as sharply. Like it does not stir me up in a positive direction towards a passionate love for Christ. And so, if I catch myself doing this, I can, number one, it's an indicator that I'm not as good as I should be with Jesus, but also number two, it tends to be an indicator light that something underneath that is unhealthy, whether it's I'm trying to cope and cover up by numbing myself with entertainment, or I'm distracted and fighting sloth and laziness with videos, or I'm not getting enough sleep, or I'm not eating well, or I'm not doing the things, I'm not connecting in relationships the way that I ought to be. My screen time per se goes up in correlation with my internal emotional health, I think. And so I binge all day on something, and I'm not coming out of that feeling like refreshed and full of the Spirit, So I think it can be an indicator light probably for me of spiritual unhealth and even emotional unhealth.
I think it also can be a tool just that we use to like affirm a secular worldview instead of like turning to the Bible for a biblical worldview. I mean, the messages that a lot of media present are very world-based, and a lot of times the choices that we're making are going to be affirmed in what we watch. And it's like a false comfort, like, oh, they're doing it, I'm fine, as opposed to like, no, God calls us out of sin, and now we're justifying it by what we see on a TV show or scrolling through YouTube videos.
Yeah. And I'm with you both on that. And I feel like when those certain days where I just feel off, whether I'm like short with people, it's just, it's almost like, it's like what you were talking, Chris, and you've said this before, probably in other sermons and stuff like that, but like we're embodied people, and like everything is connected, like our minds, our souls, our bodies, everything is. And so it's like the reverse of that. When I am spending time with the Lord in scripture, reading everything like that, like you see that in the rest of your life, like everything that you do, like everything that I do, like the rest of my day, if I start with that, like it just comes out in every other aspect of my life. And the reverse of that is true too. If I'm spending so much time on my phone, or if I'm waking up in the morning and the first thing I do instead of going to the Word is, let's see what the news says or something like that, I feel it the rest of the day. And like everything that I do, interactions that I have, it just feels like, yeah, like whether I'm short with my wife or my kids, it's like, yeah, because being a part, like just seeing these things or reading these things affects like everything, like every other part of you. And so it's a problem.
Yeah. Think of it as, I'm quoting a book here, but like it disorders your loves, like the loves that you have. So I remember this from college, but I remember The Notebook, that movie came out. Remember this rom-com? Or that's not even a com, it's just a rom.
It's a rom.
It's a rom. A rom-rom.
A rom-drom.
Rom-drom. We're coming up with new things.
Is that a real thing?
No, I don't know.
It sounds really cool, but
sounds legit.
But I remember specifically girls in college watching that movie and thinking, oh, like this is real. This is reality. This is the thing, right? And it's the guy and his girl, and they finally get together, and it's one true love, even though she's engaged to somebody else, and they break up that engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the whole love story, and, rowboat in the rain and all this stuff. And then they die in the same bed, holding hands in the hospital. And that is what love is.
Mm.
And then that disorders your view of your love, your heart towards what relationships are going to be like. And so while that does not have maybe explicit language or, gratuitous violence or whatever, that is disordering the patterns of our hearts and what we really desire. So when you talk about being embodied, what we are watching and consuming affects our hearts. It affects our minds. It affects our outlook on life. And it redefines outside of the biblical worldview how we see reality and what we want to pursue and what is right and wrong. And it's almost, we don't need to get into pornography here, but it's like that effect. It pornographies our vision around what is a false and disordered reality. And we think that's the gold standard. Just like pornography does with sex, it sets up some unattainable standard. This is an unattainable standard when it comes to life, when it comes to marriage, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to even the value of entertainment. Like, it's so in our face, shock and awe, always on the move, that normal things like, it's an old Seinfeld quote, but like George Costanza can't even read a book anymore because it's too boring for him. Because he's so used to seeing movies. And so Breakfast at Tiffany's, he's like, I can't read this book. I got to go see the movie.
Yeah. I had a friend who said, I can't even fall now without it. Like, if it's not fail worthy, like that, even that whole standard, like we can't even fail normal. Like, now if we're going to fail, we have to fail extravagantly.
Wow. Yeah.
So what, and I know like a lot of this is, I don't want to say it's like negative talk against it, but it's reality. But what about those people that say, well, I'm not as affected by it as you guys are like talking about or whatever? Like, is it possible to consume media and not be as affected by it?
Can you do this?
Can you do it? Is it possible? Don't tell me, well, anything's possible.
I think this one depends in a lot of ways on personality type. I do think people have different levels of sensitivity, but here's what I would say as a blanket statement. No. Everything affects you. Like, any content that you consume from media affects you. Now, does it affect you in a detrimental way? Well, that's maybe going to be a person-to-person case, but everything affects you. And the scriptures, I put all these in the notes, but the scriptures are ripe with this. Philippians 4:8, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Like, that's Paul saying, hey, make sure that you are dwelling on things that are wholesome, that are good, that are true, that are beautiful. Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? So like, there's this idea that you can be conformed to patterns in this world. And those are big deal. And then Proverbs 4:23, which is one of my favorites, is keep your heart. It says, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life. So it's like, watch your heart, like watch what you're giving yourself over to. So then back to your question. Well, this doesn't affect me. Oh, listening to music with really explicit language, it doesn't affect me. No, it does. It does. Whether it's a drop in a bucket or a drop in a glass or a drop in another drop, it does affect you at some level. You might have a different tolerance, but it certainly affects you. It certainly affects you. So that's what I would say. I don't think we can go global and just say you should never listen to music with cussing in it, or you should never watch a show that's above a certain rating or something like that. But you are foolish if you think it doesn't affect you at all.
Well, and that was going to be one of my next questions, is talking about content of what, like, are there things we should steer clear of, whether that's it, like explicit music or TV, movies, all that kind of stuff, that like R-rated things that have nudity, language, all that kind of stuff. But I mean, I think you kind of answered that, Chris, with the scripture you read in Philippians. What about those? And I know we're kind of running out of time a little bit. But on the flip side of this is maybe TV, or maybe some of these things, could they be like a form of rest, or in a way seen as like I think of, for example, like music and stuff, especially if you're working, you put on background music or something to help you rest a little bit, or you have a really long day and you come home and just want to watch a show or something. Like, is there any validity in that like, can it be, or is it really still just, if it becomes too long, it's just it's being lazy, a waste of time, all this kind of stuff? But like can it be a form of kind of rest?
What do you think, Karina?
I think I struggle with that, because I mean, there is a level of enjoyment watching it, but true rest, I think, comes from like those disciplines of learning to like, be still and know that he is God, to rest in silence, to, and it's a thing I'm always telling my kids, like it's okay to be bored, and in that boredom, like God gives us good gifts. And so I don't know if that really answers the question. I kind of sidestepped it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so there's a couple angles that I think about that question, and I think about it the same way that I would think about alcohol, in that if I get home from a long day at stress, I'm maybe a little bit down, I'm discouraged, I'm depressed, there can be this tug to try and numb that out. And you can numb that out with a couple of Coors, or you can numb that out with a couple of episodes of Friends. I mean, you can numb with distraction just as easily as you can with a depressant. So I just be careful about, I guess I would be careful about what your state of your heart is, even in entering into entertainment. Like I'm going to go see a movie with your husband in a couple of days, and it's not like that's sinful for us to, because we're just going to go and hang out and have lunch and go see a movie. And I think that'll be great, right? Like that's a fun, exciting, entertaining afternoon. Is it restful? Well, it's restful to be with a friend, and but it's different than like soul rest that I'm looking for in Sabbath. So I don't know that I would equate that one to one, but it's not like, oh man, I'm just so burnt out, I've just got to, veg and, shut my brain off. Well, that's not a healthy way to actually deal with stress or busyness or depression, goodness, or lots of things. So I would look at your motives. I'd check your heart when it comes to these things. Because I mean, 1 Corinthians 10, I'll quote this: all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful, right? All things are lawful. That's what Paul says, but not all things build up. So am I building myself up, or am I covering stuff up? Yeah. Am I building myself up, or am I actually just filling myself with a bunch of crap that is going to pollute me?
That was the exact verse I was just about to read. But that, I mean, it goes along with, Karina, what you said too, of like sure, you could turn something on to maybe rest or something like that, but like, is that the best thing to do when you could be like, hey, I'm gonna spend, like you said about somebody praying for a couple hours? It's like, or could I spend this doing something more important? Yeah, it might not be bad to watch one show that's not a terrible show, but is it actually restful? Is it actually, bettering my life right now, or my relationship with the Lord, and that kind of stuff? So I think that's a good verse to just throw out there. Any last little things about, let me just, and really quickly, if you guys have like what's some actual practical things that we could, if somebody's listening to this and being like, whoa, I do this way too much. I'm the one spending 7.5 hours in front of a screen watching videos, and I don't think it's that bad, but maybe it is. Like, what are some practical things that maybe you guys do, whether it's on your phones or your computers or your time at home, that kind of stuff? What are some things that Christians that we can try to like implement some things that we can actually like help us in this if we're struggling with it.
Yeah, I think just knowing, like for me, if I read a book, I get sucked in. I literally cannot read without shutting out the outer world. And I inherited this, and I saw like what this looked like, and I knew that's not what I wanted to do. So I limit my seasons of reading. And so that way I'm not just constantly absorbed in books, because I become a less better. And so it's just like knowing you have to be honest with yourself, and you have to be aware, and know like, hey, no, I'm not the kind of person who can just read a chapter and then put it down and move on with my day. I'm the person who will be like, oh, it's 4 a.m. and I can still read one more chapter. So I think just being honest and knowing your limits, and knowing when you need to set it aside and replace it with something that's not going to consume you.
Yeah. I mean, think about it like grocery shopping. Don't ever go grocery shopping hungry, right? Don't ever go grocery shopping without a list. And maybe this is something that, I mean, how many times have you, or I mean, I'll confess this, have, you know, you're watching a show and then it's, you know, 9:30, 10:30, and you're like, you get to that next one and Netflix sets 10 seconds, you know, 10 seconds. And you're like, can I do one more? Can I do one more? Can I do one more? And from reading to watching TV, make a plan. Hey, I'm only going to watch one show or two shows or one movie, or, you know, what are the days? What are the times? What's my bedtime? Like, what am I going to do to create a boundary? Make those rules before you start watching, before you start consuming. Make the list before you get to the grocery store, so that you're not just buying Cheetos and Lucky Charms and, you know, candy, but buy the things that you know are good for you. Watch the things and limit yourself from things that you know you should be limiting.
And if you're really struggling, like, find someone to keep you accountable. Yeah. And I mean, that can be your spouse, a friend, a sibling that can call in, whatever. Hey, I'm starting this movie. Will you make sure I'm...
Yeah, Jesus says, hey, if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off, right? So like, it might be drastic. You might not be in the place where you can have cable, where you can have Netflix, where you can have a Spotify right now. And that's okay too. Actually, that's really wise and mature if you can see those things in yourself.
Right. And I mean, there's also, I feel like we've talked about this a few times, but settings on your phone. I mean, everybody has a smartphone. Like I've got some settings on that only lets me be on certain like social media apps for 30 minutes a day or something like that, 45 minutes a day. And then it turns them on. It's
7 hours a day,
7.5 hours a day. But honestly, I think I'll end with this. I do feel like I keep going back to that verse. I think it's in Matthew, for out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. That it's like, if I would just feel like, just look at yourself, look at your heart, look at your actions, look at your words. And if they just feel like a lot of the shows and stuff you're watching, like if your language becomes a lot like there's something going on, that you're consuming this stuff and it is affecting you. And so, I feel like we all kind of can sense that when something's off with us, or we're just having a not so good day, or we're being short with people, or mad or angry or whatever like that. And maybe that is because of the things that we put our eyes on or listen to or read or whatever like that, that's just getting in the way and becoming more important than time with God, than actual real rest.
Sorry, I was checking out a video on YouTube.
Oh, were you? Okay, I thought you were going to say something. And we'll end with that. Chris watching videos on YouTube. Any last words?
Good.
Thank you guys for this conversation. Thank you, church, for listening, and we'll see you next time.